The day you sign a document without reading the fine print, you don't expect it to cost you your home. It was a Tuesday morning, 8:12 a.m., and I was standing in line at a gas station, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail I hadn't earned. By noon, my name was no longer on the lease. What stayed with me wasn't the notice, it was that the lock on my door had been changed before I even got home. And that was the moment I realized everything I trusted was already working against me. The day you sign a document without reading the fine print, you don't expect it to cost you your home. That sentence would have sounded dramatic to me once. Something people say on the internet to scare strangers. But on a Tuesday morning in early October, it became the most ordinary fact of my life. It was 8:12 a.m. I remember because I had just pulled into the Shell station off Route 9, the one with the flickering digital sign that never quite gets the price right. I was running late, already rehearsing excuses in my head for my supervisor, telling myself I'd skip breakfast and grab something later. I had my phone tucked between my shoulder and ear, listening to a voicemail that had come in while I was driving. I hadn't checked it yet. I don't know why. Maybe because the caller ID was a number I didn't recognize, and I assumed it was another robocall about extended warranties or political surveys. I paid for the gas, grabbed a burnt-smelling coffee from the counter, and stood there stirring powdered creamer with one of those thin red straws. That's when my phone buzzed again. Same voicemail notification, 2 minutes old, still unheard. I hit play. "Miss Carter," the man said, his voice flat, professional, the way people sound when they've said the same thing 100 times already. "This is a courtesy notice regarding the termination of your residential lease at 417 Maple Ridge Drive. Effective immediately. Please vacate the premises by end of day. Failure to comply may result in legal action." I stood there long enough that the cashier asked if I was okay. I nodded, too quickly, and walked out without taking the coffee I'd paid for. I didn't feel panicked yet. That came later. In that moment, my brain latched onto one word and refused to let go. Courtesy. I had lived at 417 Maple Ridge for almost 4 years. A small townhouse on the edge of a planned community outside Columbus, Ohio. Beige siding, identical mailboxes, an HOA that sent passive-aggressive emails about trash bins and lawn height. It wasn't special, but it was mine. I paid my rent on time. I kept my head down. I followed the rules. I even attended the annual HOA meetings, sitting on folding chairs in the rec center, listening to people argue about parking permits and holiday decorations. I'd never received a warning, no late notices, no complaints taped to my door, nothing. By the time I got back in my car, my hands were shaking. I tried calling the number back, straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice tight, asking for clarification, saying there must be some mistake. I said my full name twice, spelled it out, like that might help. Traffic was light. I drove to work on autopilot, my mind cycling through possibilities. Wrong number. Clerical error. Scam. That had to be it. You don't lose your home through a voicemail. Not in America. Not without paperwork. Not without a chance to fix whatever went wrong. At 10:37 a.m., an email came through. Subject line: Lease termination confirmation. Attached was a PDF. 3 pages, dense paragraphs, legal language, my name typed neatly at the top, my address, today's date, and my signature. I stared at it until the words blurred. That wasn't my signature. Not really. It looked like mine in the way a stranger's handwriting can look familiar if you don't examine it too closely. Same first initial, same slant, but the loop in the L was wrong. I'd always made it wider, something I picked up in middle school and never shook. This one was tight, rushed, like someone imitating muscle memory they didn't fully understand. I scrolled down. There it was again, initialed on every page. The timestamp at the bottom said the document had been signed electronically at 6:48 a.m. At 6:48 a.m., I was in the shower, washing conditioner out of my hair, mentally planning what I'd wear to work. I remembered that clearly because I'd nicked my ankle shaving and stood there for a minute waiting for the bleeding to stop. There was still a small bandage on it when I looked down. I forwarded the email to my personal account. Then I forwarded it again, this time to my supervisor with a short message saying I needed to leave early due to a housing emergency. She replied almost immediately. Of course, take care of yourself. By noon, I was driving back toward Maple Ridge, my heart pounding harder with every mile. I tried the leasing office again. This time someone picked up. Yes, the woman said, after I gave my name. Your lease was terminated this morning. There has to be a mistake, I said. I didn't sign anything. She paused, just for a beat. We have a signed document on file. I want to see it in person, I said. I want to talk to someone face to face. You're welcome to stop by, she replied. But the termination is effective immediately. I pulled into the development just after 1 o'clock. The sky was a dull, washed-out gray, the kind that makes everything look flatter than it really is. I parked in my usual spot and walked toward my front door, already rehearsing what I'd say when I got inside. I planned to grab my laptop, some clothes, my passport. Just in case. My key didn't work. I tried again, harder this time, the metal scraping uselessly against the lock. That's when I noticed the small sticker on the doorframe. Bright orange, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Property secured. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for a neighbor to walk past with her dog, nod politely, and keep going. Long enough to notice that my welcome mat had been rolled up and leaned against the wall, like someone had decided it didn't belong there anymore. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat down on the concrete step and pressed my back against the door that had stopped recognizing me. My phone buzzed in my hand. Another email. This one was from the HOA. Subject line, account update. It informed me, politely, that my access to community amenities had been revoked due to a change in residency status. Pool, gym, parking privileges, all suspended. At the bottom of the email was a sentence that felt almost personal in its indifference. If you believe this message was sent in error, please contact management. I looked up at the identical rows of townhouses, all with their identical doors and identical locks, and felt something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was the realization that this hadn't happened suddenly at all. Someone had planned it. Someone had known exactly which buttons to press, which systems to use, which assumptions I would make about how things worked. I had trusted paperwork, trusted emails, trusted that if I followed the rules would protect me. Sitting there on my own front step, locked out of my life before the afternoon was over, I understood something I'd never had to face before. Everything I believed about safety, about fairness, about how much control I actually had over my own life, was already cracking. And I didn't even know who had started it yet. I didn't leave Maple Ridge right away. That was the first mistake, though I wouldn't realize it until much later. I sat there on the concrete step until the chill seeped through my jeans and into my legs, until the orange sticker on the door stopped looking surreal and started looking official. When you grow up believing systems are neutral, your instinct isn't to run. It's to wait for clarification. Eventually, I stood up and walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel with the engine off, hands resting in my lap, staring at the townhouse like it might blink and admit this was all some clerical joke. It didn't. The door stayed closed. The lock stayed new and unfamiliar. I drove to the leasing office because that's what reasonable people do. The building sat at the entrance of the community, all glass windows and faux stone trim, a flag out front that snapped in the wind. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The same 2 women sat behind the counter as always, their nameplates angled just so. They looked up when I walked in, and I could tell immediately that they knew who I was. "Hi," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I'm here about my lease." The woman on the left gave a tight smile. "Miss Carter, yes, we were expecting you." That word again. Expecting. She slid a clipboard toward me with a practiced motion. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." I didn't sit. I leaned on the counter, fingers gripping the edge. "I want to know why my lease was terminated without notice." She glanced at the other woman, then back at me. "We have documentation on file indicating you voluntarily ended your tenancy." "That document is forged," I said. "I didn't sign it." Her expression didn't change. "The signature matches our records." "It doesn't," I said. "I want to see the original." She tapped a few keys on her keyboard, the sound loud in the quiet office. "We don't retain physical originals for electronic filings." Then I want to know who submitted it. Another pause. That information is confidential. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that surprised both of us. My name is on it. And your signature, she replied evenly. That was when I understood something important. This conversation wasn't about truth, it was about procedure, and procedure had already decided. I left the office 10 minutes later with a printout of the same PDF I already had on my phone and a polite suggestion to contact legal counsel if I wished to dispute the matter. No apology, no acknowledgement of error, just process. I sat in my car again, this time long enough for the reality to start settling in. I needed somewhere to go. I scrolled through my contacts, thumb hovering over names, friends, coworkers, people I grabbed drinks with occasionally. None of them knew me well enough for this. None of them lived close. And I couldn't bring myself to explain, not yet. So I did the practical thing. I booked a hotel, a mid-range place off the highway, 15 minutes from my job. 2 queen beds, beige carpet, the kind of place that smells like industrial laundry detergent and regret. The front desk clerk didn't ask questions. She handed me a key card and pointed me toward the elevator. That first night, I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in fragments. The voicemail, the PDF, the lock. Over and over, my mind circled back to the same question. How? The answer I kept coming back to was unsatisfying but familiar. Paperwork. Somewhere, somehow, a system had accepted something false as true. And once that happened, everything else followed naturally. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had happened. I showed up on time. I answered emails. I smiled at coworkers. There's a particular kind of discipline you learn as a woman in America. No matter how unstable your life feels, you perform stability. You don't bleed in public. During my lunch break, I called my bank. I needed to make sure nothing else had been compromised. The woman on the line was kind, reassuring. No unusual activity. No changes. I thanked her and hung up, feeling foolish for being relieved. Then I checked my credit report. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe confirmation that this nightmare was contained. Instead, I found 3 new inquiries dated that same morning. Property management companies. Utility services. A storage facility. It felt like discovering footprints in your house that didn't belong to you. By the end of the week, my hotel stay had become a routine. Wake up, shower, drive to work, drive back, eat something from a takeout container balanced on the small desk, sleep. I kept telling myself this was temporary. A hiccup. Once I talked to the right person, it would be fixed. On Friday, I called my mother. I hadn't planned to, it just happened. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone, and her name was suddenly on the screen. "Hey," she said, cheerful. "How are you?" I hesitated, then gave the answer she expected. "I'm okay, busy." "That's good," she said. "Listen, your aunt is coming into town next month. We were thinking—" "Mom," I interrupted. "I got locked out of my apartment this week." Silence stretched across the line. "What do you mean, locked out?" I explained, as calmly as I could. The voicemail, the signature, the lock change. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Well," she said, "that sounds complicated." "It is," I agreed. "Are you sure you didn't sign something?" she asked. "Sometimes these leases have renewal clauses or buyouts." "No," I said, sharper than I meant to. "I'm sure." Another pause. "I'm just saying, honey, these things don't usually happen without a reason." There it was. Not disbelief exactly, just distance. The subtle suggestion that systems don't make mistakes, people do. "I have to go," I said, before my voice could crack. That night, I finally cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, shaking release into a hotel pillow that didn't know me. When it passed, I felt hollow but clearer. I needed information, real information, not explanations designed to end conversations. Saturday morning, I went back to Maple Ridge. I parked a block away this time and walked the rest, scanning the row of townhouses. Mine looked the same as always. Curtains drawn, porch light off. No sign of my life anywhere. I walked to the side of the building and checked the utility meters. My unit's meter had a red tag on it, disconnected. Someone had moved fast. I knocked on my neighbor's door. A woman in her 40s answered, peering at me through the crack. "Hi," I said. "I'm from next door. I was wondering if you'd noticed anyone around my place this week." She hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. "There were movers," she said. "Wednesday morning." My stomach dropped. "Movers?" "Yes, a truck. They didn't stay long. Took some boxes." "I didn't authorize that," I said. She shrugged, apologetic. "Badges?" "Of course they did." I thanked her and walked back to my car, my mind racing. Movers meant someone had accessed my unit, had taken things, my laptop, my files, the shoebox of old documents I kept under my bed because I didn't trust myself to throw them away. That was the moment the fear finally arrived. Not a sharp spike, but a heavy weight. This wasn't just about losing a place to live. It was about access, control. Someone had stepped into my life and rearranged it without my consent. As I sat there, phone in hand, a thought surfaced that I didn't want to acknowledge. This felt personal, too targeted, too efficient, too clean. I didn't know who was behind it yet. I didn't know why. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had taken my home wasn't finished with me. And the longer I kept waiting for the system to fix itself, the more ground I was losing. The next few days blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. I kept thinking it was Monday when it was already Thursday, kept reaching for things that weren't there anymore. My toothbrush on the right side of the sink, my coat hanging by the door. Muscle memory is cruel like that. It reminds you of what you've lost before your mind has caught up. I stopped going back to Maple Ridge after that Saturday. Seeing the place from the outside did more damage than staying away. Instead, I focused on what I could still access: my bank account, my email, my work computer. I changed passwords late at night in the hotel room, sitting cross-legged on the bed, creating combinations I knew I wouldn't remember. I wrote them down on hotel stationery and shoved the paper into my purse. On Tuesday morning, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. "Hi Olivia, this is Mark from Evergreen Property Solutions. We handle post-termination logistics. Please confirm a time for item retrieval." I read it 3 times before responding. "Item retrieval?" The reply came almost immediately. "Personal belongings remaining at 417 Maple Ridge. Per your signed agreement, items were inventoried and relocated for temporary storage. Fees may apply after 72 hours. My signed agreement. There it was again. That phrase, neat and final. I asked where the items were stored. Mark sent me an address for a storage facility on the other side of the city. He included a unit number and a time window. No apology, no explanation. I took the afternoon off work and drove there. The facility sat between a tire shop and a closed-down diner, its faded sign buzzing faintly in the daylight. Inside, the air smelled like dust and cardboard. A man at the front desk asked for my ID, typed my name into his computer, and nodded. "Unit's unlocked," he said. "Take what you need. Just let us know when you're done." The unit was smaller than I expected. 5 by 10. A concrete box with a single flickering bulb. Inside were cardboard boxes stacked unevenly, some crushed at the corners. My boxes. I recognized the blue tape I always used because it was cheaper at Costco. I opened the first one with shaking hands. Clothes. Folded, but not by me. My sweaters stacked in the wrong order. My work shoes tossed in sideways. The second box held kitchen items. Plates wrapped in newspaper. Utensils loose at the bottom. The third box made my stomach drop. It was lighter than it should have been. Inside were folders. Open. Empty. I sank down onto the concrete floor and started digging through the rest. Box after box. Books. Shoes. Random junk I'd been meaning to donate. But the things that mattered, the things I never thought I'd need until now, were gone. My laptop. My external hard drive. The manila folder where I kept copies of old leases, insurance forms, tax returns. The small, fireproof pouch with my passport and birth certificate. I stood up slowly, the room spinning. I walked back to the front desk. "Some items are missing," I said. The man barely looked up. Everything that was inventoried should be in the unit. Well, it's not, I replied. I need a list. He sighed, like I was asking him to fix a printer. You'll have to contact Evergreen. I did. Repeatedly. Emails, calls, voicemails. When Mark finally responded, it was with a short message. Inventory matches items collected. We are not responsible for personal record discrepancies. That was when something in me shifted. Not into anger, exactly. Into clarity. This wasn't sloppy. It wasn't random. Someone had known exactly what to take. I drove back to the hotel and spread what remained of my belongings across the bed. Clothes, books, a framed photo of me and my dad at a baseball game years ago. Everything else, my paper trail, my proof of existence, had been selectively erased. That night, I slept with the lights on. The following morning, I went to the police station. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do. Theft, forgery, identity misuse. Those words sounded solid, official, things that had processes attached to them. The officer at the desk listened politely as I explained. He asked me to spell my name, asked for dates, asked for documentation. I don't have the originals, I said. They were taken. He nodded slowly. Do you have copies? Not anymore. Another nod. He typed for a while, the clicking of the keyboard filling the silence. Without proof of unauthorized entry or clear evidence of forgery, he said carefully, there's not much we can pursue right now. So someone can sign my name, lock me out of my home, take my documents, and that's just it? He met my eyes, something like sympathy flickering there. Civil matters can get complicated. Civil. Another word that sounded gentle until it wasn't. I left with a case number and no expectations. Over the next week, small things started happening. Things that, on their own, might have seemed insignificant. A letter from my health insurance provider, informing me that my address had been updated. A notification from my cell phone company about a change request I hadn't made. An email from my employer's HR department asking me to confirm my current residence for payroll records. I began keeping a notebook. Nothing fancy. Just a cheap spiral-bound one I bought at the drugstore. I wrote down dates, times, who contacted me, what they said. I didn't know why I was doing it. It just felt necessary. One evening, while flipping through the notebook, I noticed something. All the changes, the lease termination, the storage transfer, the address updates had been processed through third-party management services, outsourced systems, intermediaries, and one name kept appearing: Evergreen. Evergreen Property Solutions, Evergreen Storage Coordination, Evergreen Resident Services. I Googled them. The website was polished but vague. Stock photos, generic language about streamlining residential transitions. No leadership names, just a contact form and a P.O. box address. I searched deeper. Business filings, LLC registrations. The company had been incorporated less than a year ago. No reviews older than 6 months. The address traced back to a shared office space. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding. Evergreen wasn't a company in the traditional sense. It was a tool. Someone had built it for a specific purpose. The question was who. The answer didn't come immediately. It arrived sideways. On Friday afternoon, as I was leaving work, my supervisor stopped me. "Hey," she said. "HR had a question about your housing situation. They got an email." "What kind of email?" She hesitated. "Someone claiming to represent your landlord. They were concerned." "Concerned about what?" "That you might be experiencing instability," she said gently. "They suggested we keep an eye on things." My mouth went dry. "Did they say why?" She shook her head. "Just vague references. We told them it wasn't appropriate." I nodded, thanked her, and walked out to my car, my legs trembling. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about the apartment, or the paperwork, or even the documents they'd taken. This was about positioning. Someone was shaping a narrative around me. Unstable tenant, disorganized, unreliable. The kind of person systems quietly move around without resistance. I sat in my car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, breathing slowly. I thought about all the times I'd trusted default settings. Trusted that if I didn't make noise, nothing bad would happen. Whatever was happening now thrived on that assumption. And for the first time since that Tuesday morning, I stopped waiting for clarification. I started paying attention. Once I realized someone was shaping a story about me, my instinct wasn't to confront them, it was to correct myself. That sounds backward, I know, but it made sense at the time. I had spent my entire adult life believing that if you were precise enough, careful enough, compliant enough, the system would eventually reward you, or at least leave you alone. So I doubled down on being reasonable. I sent polite follow-up emails. I organized my notebook into color-coded tabs. I called customer service lines and waited on hold without complaining. I said, "Thank you," too often. I asked what documentation was needed, how long reviews usually took, what the appropriate next steps were. Every conversation followed the same pattern. "We understand your concern. This is an unusual situation. We'll need to escalate this." And then nothing. Days passed. Then a week. My hotel stay stretched longer than I wanted to admit. I negotiated a discounted rate with the front desk manager, smiling like this was a minor inconvenience, like I wasn't slowly hemorrhaging money every night I slept in that room. I told myself I would fix this before it reached the point of real damage, before my job was affected, before my credit took a hit, before people started quietly categorizing me as a problem. That fear, that subtle, professional fear, kept me moving in straight lines. I updated my resume, just in case. I forwarded my mail to a temporary P.O. box. I bought a cheap lockbox from Target and stored the few documents I managed to replace. I scheduled appointments at government offices to request new copies of my birth certificate, my passport application marked urgent. Every task took longer than it should have. Every office required another form, another waiting period, another fee. I complied without protest. At night, alone in the hotel room, I replayed conversations in my head, searching for mistakes, things I should have said differently, tones I should have softened, questions I should have asked sooner. If I had caught the forged signature earlier, if I had checked my credit report more often, if I had read every line of every document I ever signed. That kind of thinking is seductive. It gives you the illusion of control. It suggests that the chaos has rules, and if you just understand them better, you can reverse the damage. One evening, as I was eating dinner off a plastic fork, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. "Miss Carter," a man said. Calm, professional. "This is Daniel from Evergreen Resident Services. I'm calling to follow up on your inquiry." My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, I've been trying to get clarification on missing items and the termination process. I think." "Of course," he said smoothly. "We understand this transition has been stressful." Transition. As if this were a job change or a move I'd planned. "I just want my records," I said. "And I want to correct the false information being shared about me." There was a brief pause. Not long enough to be awkward. Just long enough to be deliberate. "Miss Carter," Daniel said. "From our perspective, everything has been handled in accordance with your instructions." "My instructions," I repeated. "Yes, the signed agreement authorized us to coordinate logistics and notify relevant parties to ensure continuity." "Notify who?" I asked. "Property management, utility providers, in some cases, employers, when residency is tied to compliance requirements." I felt a cold sensation crawl up my spine. "My residency has nothing to do with my job." "We don't make those determinations," he replied. "We simply relay information provided to us." "And who provided it?" I pressed. Another pause. "That information is protected." I closed my eyes. "You're telling people I'm unstable." He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. "What I'm telling people," he said carefully, "is that your housing situation has changed and that certain accommodations may be necessary." Accommodations. The word landed heavily. "I want that to stop," I said. "I'm afraid that would require an amendment to the original agreement." "I didn't sign any agreement." "Adokos. We've been over this," he said, his tone still polite but firmer now. "The system reflects otherwise." When the call ended, I sat very still. Phone pressed to my ear long after the line went dead. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened TV screen. I looked tired, smaller somehow. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened my notebook and started writing differently. Not just dates and times, but language. Exact phrases, repeated words. The way people deflected responsibility without ever lying outright. How often the same terms appeared across different communications. Transition, compliance, accommodation, voluntary. This wasn't random vocabulary, it was curated. By the end of the week, my bank flagged an issue. A temporary hold on my account pending address verification. I resolved it within hours, but the message was clear. The story being told about me was beginning to ripple outward. That's when the panic finally crept in, not as hysteria, but as urgency. I started imagining worst-case scenarios. Losing my job, being denied a future lease because of prior issues. Having to explain this situation over and over, watching people's eyes change as they quietly decided who I was. I couldn't let that happen. So I tried harder to be normal. I laughed at work. I volunteered for extra shifts. I made sure to arrive early and leave late. I corrected even the smallest errors immediately. I didn't want anyone to associate my name with disruption. At the same time, I avoided conflict entirely. I stopped pushing Evergreen for answers. I stopped calling the leasing office. I told myself silence was strategic, that if I waited long enough, the attention would move elsewhere. But silence didn't slow anything down. It just made me easier to work around. One afternoon, I received an automated email informing me that a collections account had been opened in my name for early termination fees. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, then called immediately. The representative was sympathetic but unmoved. "The charges are valid per the signed lease amendment," she said. "I didn't sign it," I replied, for what felt like the 100th time. "I understand that's frustrating," she said, in the same tone people use when they don't believe you but don't want to argue. "You can dispute the charge, but the review process can take up to 60 days. 60 days. That was an eternity in credit terms. I hung up and sat there, staring at the wall, feeling something shift again. The quiet pressure had become a squeeze. Not violent. Not dramatic. Just relentless. That evening, I walked around the hotel parking lot to clear my head. Cars came and went. Families checked in with suitcases. A couple argued quietly near the entrance. Life continued around me, indifferent. I realized then that everything I'd done so far, every polite email, every careful call, every attempt to prove I was reasonable, was based on one assumption, that I needed permission to be believed. That if I could just explain myself clearly enough, the system would pause and correct course. But the system wasn't confused. It was functioning exactly as designed. Someone had learned how to push the right buttons to make me disappear quietly, to turn me into a liability without ever saying the word, to create just enough administrative noise that no single action looked malicious on its own. And I had been helping them by trying to clean up after it. Standing there under the dull yellow parking lot lights, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief. Not confidence. Recognition. I wasn't dealing with a mistake. I was dealing with a strategy. And strategies don't stop because you ask nicely. For the first time since this started, I allowed myself to consider a different approach. Not louder, not angrier. Just different. I didn't know what that approach would look like yet. I only knew this. If I kept trying to prove I was harmless, I would lose everything quietly. And whatever came next, I couldn't afford to be quiet anymore. The moment everything crossed from recoverable to irreversible didn't arrive with sirens or raised voices. It came in the form of an email I almost deleted. I was standing in line at a grocery store near the hotel, basket half full, debating whether I could justify buying fresh fruit when my phone buzzed. The subject line read, "Notice of Employment Review." It was from HR, not unusual on its own. Companies review things all the time. Policies change, forms expire. I paid, walked out to my car, and opened it. The email was careful, neutral, every sentence polished to the point of sounding humane. Due to recent information received regarding a material change in my living situation, my employer was initiating a temporary administrative review. As a precaution, my access to certain internal systems would be limited pending clarification. I was asked to attend a meeting the following morning. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, reading the email again and again. The phrase, material change in living situation, echoed in my head. They hadn't said unstable. They hadn't said unreliable. They didn't need to. The implication was enough. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying Daniel's voice from Evergreen, the way he'd said accommodations may be necessary. At the time, it had sounded abstract. Now it felt surgical. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. I arrived at 8:40, dressed the way I always did for important conversations. Neutral colors, minimal makeup, hair pulled back, nothing that could be interpreted as emotional or defensive. I carried a slim folder with printed emails and notes, even though I knew it probably wouldn't matter. The HR conference room was small and windowless. 2 people were already there. My supervisor sat on one side of the table, her expression tight with concern. Across from her was someone I'd never met before, a man in a gray suit with a legal pad resting neatly in front of him. "This is just a formality," my supervisor said as I sat down. "We want to make sure everything is okay." The man nodded. "I'm here to observe and document." Document. Another clean word. They asked me to explain my housing situation. I did, calmly, methodically. I explained the forged document, the lockout, the missing records. I told them I was staying in a hotel temporarily while I resolved the issue. The man took notes without looking up. My supervisor asked if I had documentation proving the forgery. I said I was in the process of obtaining replacements. I mentioned the police report, the case number. He finally looked up then. "Has any court or authority formally determined that the document was fraudulent?" "No," I said, "not yet." He nodded once and wrote something down. "We received communication," he continued, "from a third-party property service indicating concerns about your stability and decision-making." My chest tightened. "They're lying." "We're not making a judgment," he said quickly. "We're assessing risk." Risk. There it was. The meeting ended with reassurances that this was temporary, that no decisions had been made, that I would be notified once the review concluded. But as I walked out of the room, my badge no longer opened certain doors. My email access was limited. Small things, controlled things. By noon, I was functionally sidelined. I sat in my car afterward, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling something in me finally crack, not break, but split open. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was an escalation. I drove back to the hotel and stared at the wall for a long time. The room felt smaller than it had the night before. Like it was closing in. That afternoon, I received another email. This one from a collections agency. The early termination fees had been officially reported. My credit score dropped 47 points in a single update. I refreshed the screen, as if it might change. It didn't. The implications stacked up quickly. With damaged credit, finding a new place would be harder. Without stable housing, my job was at risk. Without my job, everything else would follow. It was a chain reaction, each link forged by paperwork I hadn't signed and decisions I hadn't made. I called Evergreen again. This time, Daniel answered on the second ring. "I need this to stop," I said. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're interfering with my employment now." "I'm sorry you feel that way," he replied smoothly. "Our role is purely administrative. You told my employer I was unstable." "I relayed information provided to us," he said. "Nothing more." 8. "By who?" I demanded. There was a pause. Longer this time. "That information," he said, "is not something we can discuss." I felt a sharp, bitter laugh rise in my throat. "So you can dismantle my life? But you can't tell me who asked you to." "I would encourage you," he said, "to focus on resolving your housing issue. Once that's addressed, many of these concerns will naturally resolve themselves." There it was, the trap laid bare. "Fix the housing issue," he implied. "Accept the premise. Play along. Agree, implicitly, that the termination was valid and work within its framework. Once I did that, the rest would fall into place." Except it wouldn't. Because the housing issue wasn't the problem. It was the lever. That evening, I called my mother again. Not for advice, not for comfort, just to hear a voice that wasn't filtered through policy language. When I told her about the job review, she was quiet for a long time. "Well," she said finally, Maybe this is a sign you should take a step back. Reset. Sometimes things happen for a reason. I closed my eyes. This isn't a lesson, I said. This is someone doing this to me. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. My life had been reduced to what fit in 2 suitcases and a few boxes in storage. Everything else, my sense of continuity, my assumptions about fairness had been quietly confiscated. That night, I made a list. Not of tasks. Of losses. My home. My records. My credit. My standing at work. Each one had been taken without confrontation, without explanation, without my consent. And every attempt I'd made to contest it had been absorbed, neutralized, redirected into process. I realized then that I had reached the point of no return. Not because things couldn't be fixed, but because even if they were, the damage would remain. Someone had proven they could reach into my life at will. And as long as I kept trying to repair the surface, they would keep pulling at the structure underneath. The next morning, I received a final message from Evergreen. Per policy, any further disputes must be submitted in writing. Please refrain from direct contact. They had closed the door. I stared at the message, then at my notebook lying open on the desk. Pages filled with dates, phrases, patterns. A record I'd started without knowing why. I thought about the meeting with HR, the words they'd chosen, the way concern had been used as a weapon. And for the first time since this began, I stopped asking myself how to fix it. I asked myself a different question. Who benefits if I disappear quietly? The answer wasn't immediate, but it hovered just beneath the surface, heavy and unmistakable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even just corporate indifference. It was an extraction. Someone wanted something: access, leverage, silence, and removing me cleanly was the most efficient way to get it. Sitting there, in that anonymous hotel room, watching the sun set through the thin curtains, I understood something else too. Whatever they thought they were taking from me, they had miscalculated one thing. They assumed I would keep trying to get back to where I'd been. They assumed I would beg the system to let me in again. But that was the moment I realized I couldn't afford to go backward. Because backward led straight into the trap they'd built. And if I wanted any chance of surviving what was coming next, I would have to stop trying to restore my old life and start figuring out how to step outside the frame they were controlling. Once I stopped trying to restore my old life, the noise around me changed. Not less loud, just easier to sort. Panic scrambles everything. Distance sharpens it. I took 3 days off work. Officially, I told HR I needed time to gather documentation related to the review. Unofficially, I needed to think without pretending to be okay. I stayed in the hotel, kept the curtains open, forced myself onto a schedule so the hours wouldn't dissolve into each other. Every morning, I rewrote the same list in my notebook. What do I know for sure? What do I assume? What can be proven? The first category was small, the second was enormous, the third was empty. So I started filling it. I went back to the beginning, not emotionally, but structurally. The lease termination hadn't happened in isolation. It had been processed through multiple systems, all of which relied on the same digital handoff. Someone had submitted something. Someone else had approved it without question. Then a cascade had followed. That meant there were records, logs, metadata, things no one bothered to erase because they didn't think anyone would look. I started with what I still controlled. My email. I searched for every message from the leasing office over the last 4 years. Renewal notices, payment confirmations, maintenance requests. I downloaded them all and saved them to a cloud folder under a neutral name. Nothing dramatic. Just receipts. Next, I logged into the resident portal I still had access to, surprisingly, that hadn't been revoked. The interface was clunky, half broken, but it showed timestamps. I scrolled through the activity history. There it was. A login at 6:41 a.m. on the day my lease was terminated. From a device I didn't recognize. The IP address wasn't local. It wasn't even in Ohio. I copied it into my notebook. Then I called my cell provider. I asked, very calmly, if there had been any SIM changes, forwarding requests, or account access attempts in the last 30 days. The representative put me on hold, came back, and told me there had been one address change request submitted online. It hadn't gone through because additional verification was required. The request timestamp matched the lease termination window. I wrote that down too. By the end of the first day, my notebook was no longer just a record of frustration. It was a map. Incomplete, but directional. The second day, I went to the public library. I didn't want to use my work computer. I didn't want to use the hotel Wi-Fi for anything sensitive. The library felt anonymous in a way that was suddenly comforting. Rows of computers, no one paying attention. I searched business filings again, this time slower. Evergreen Property Solutions led to 3 related LLCs, all registered within a 6-week window. Same registered agent, same mailing address, different names, different purposes. One of them caught my eye. Evergreen Compliance Consulting. That word again. Compliance. I pulled the filing. The listed manager wasn't Daniel. It was a woman named Rachel Bloom. The name didn't ring a bell at first, then it did. Rachel Bloom worked in HR. Not at my company, but in the same corporate park. I'd seen her name on meeting room schedules when I booked shared conference spaces. Once, months ago, we'd been in the elevator together. She'd commented on the weather, asked what floor I was going to. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now my pulse picked up. I searched her name with Evergreen. Nothing obvious, no LinkedIn overlap, no direct connection. But when I searched Evergreen Compliance Consulting along with the name of my employer, something came up. A procurement notice, dated 8 months earlier. My company had engaged Evergreen Compliance Consulting for a limited scope assessment related to employee risk mitigation. I leaned back in the chair, heart pounding. Evergreen wasn't just some external vendor, they were inside the ecosystem. The third day, I focused on the forged signature. I pulled up every document I'd ever signed electronically. I compared timestamps, formatting, authentication steps. Most of them required 2-factor verification, email confirmation, sometimes a text. The lease termination document didn't. It had been signed through a streamlined process that bypassed secondary verification for pre-approved users. Pre-approved by who? I called the leasing office again, this time not to argue. "I'm reviewing my records," I said calmly. "Can you tell me who is authorized to submit termination requests on behalf of tenants?" The woman hesitated. "Typically the tenant themselves, or a designated representative. If you came unfiled, how is a representative designated? Through a signed authorization form. And where would that be stored? In the system. Can I request a copy?" She paused longer this time. "I'll have to check." When she came back, her voice was less confident. "There is an authorization on file, dated 3 weeks before the termination, signed by me." I closed my eyes. "Can you send it to me?" There was a sigh on the other end. "I'll submit a request." It arrived 2 hours later. The document was clean, professional, my name typed at the bottom, my signature scanned and pasted. But the email address listed under tenant contact wasn't mine. It was close, 1 letter off, close enough that most people wouldn't notice. Close enough that confirmations would disappear into the void. That email address had been used to approve the authorization. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it settling in. Someone hadn't just forged one document. They'd built a parallel version of me inside the system. A version that signed things, approved actions, quietly consented to my own removal. By that evening, I had a clearer picture than I wanted. Evergreen had facilitated the mechanics. The leasing office had followed procedure. HR had responded to signals that appeared legitimate. No single action was illegal on its own. It was elegant. And it explained something that had been bothering me since the beginning. Why no one seemed surprised? Because from their perspective, I had agreed to all of it. I printed everything at the library. IP logs, filing records, authorization forms, procurement notices. I didn't highlight. I didn't annotate. I just organized. Paper has weight. It forces people to slow down. That night, back at the hotel, I spread the documents across the bed and stared at them. I felt something unexpected, then not triumph, not relief. Grief. Not for the apartment, or even the job. For the version of myself that had believed this couldn't happen. that if you followed the rules would recognize you as real. That version was gone. In its place was someone quieter, sharper, less interested in being understood. I thought about Daniel's voice. Rachel Bloom's name. The procurement notice dated 8 months earlier. 8 months. This hadn't started with the lease. It had started when someone decided I was inconvenient. When my role, my access, my presence became a variable to manage. I gathered the papers into a folder and slid them into my bag. For the first time since this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was holding something solid. But clarity came with a new problem. I now knew enough to see the shape of what was happening, but not enough to stop it directly. Confrontation would only trigger denials. Legal action would take time I didn't have. Internal complaints would loop back through the same channels already compromised. Whoever had done this had anticipated those moves. Which meant the answer wasn't to push harder inside the system. It was to step sideways. I needed someone who didn't rely on Evergreen's language. Someone who understood how systems fail quietly. Someone who knew where leverage actually lived. As I zipped up my bag, one name surfaced in my mind. Not a lawyer, not HR, an auditor. I'd met her once, years ago, at a cross-department training. She'd said something then that had stuck with me. Most fraud isn't aggressive, she'd said. It's polite. It waits for you to assume no one would bother. I hadn't thought about her since. Now, sitting alone in a hotel room that no longer felt temporary, I pulled out my phone and searched her name. She still worked there. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that this wasn't just about getting my life back. It was about deciding whether I was willing to let the version of me they'd created continue to exist. Because as long as that shadow version signed things on my behalf, none of this was really over. And I wasn't done yet. I didn't call the auditor right away. That surprised me, because for days she had felt like the obvious next step, the responsible step, the kind of move people expect when they hear a story like mine. But the more I thought about it, the clearer something else became. I wasn't ready to hand this over. Not yet. Up to that point, every time I'd involved an authority leasing office, police, HR, I'd been forced into defense, explaining, proving, waiting. Each time, the conversation had been shaped before I ever opened my mouth. I was always responding to a version of events someone else had already defined. If I went to the auditor now, the same thing would happen. She'd ask for context. She'd ask who I thought was responsible. She'd open a ticket. A process would start, and processes, I had learned, were where this whole thing lived. I needed to understand the system well enough to step outside it. That realization didn't feel empowering. It felt lonely. The next morning, I packed up my hotel room and checked out. Not because I'd found somewhere else to live, but because I didn't want to be traceable in the same place anymore. I moved to a different hotel across town, paid cash for the first night, left no forwarding information beyond my email. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. If someone was monitoring changes tied to my name addresses, accounts, routines, I needed to reduce the signal. I took public transportation for a few days instead of driving, left my phone at the hotel during long walks, bought a cheap prepaid notebook and stopped using the spiral-bound one with my name written inside the cover. It felt strange, this deliberate shrinking of my footprint, but it also felt clarifying. With fewer places to be, fewer people to answer to, my thoughts stopped racing. I could finally hear the question that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else. Why me? Not in a self-pitying way. Not, why is this happening to me? But why was I worth the effort? Because effort had been involved. Careful effort. Someone had invested time into setting this up. Creating Evergreen. Registering LLCs. Building just enough legitimacy to pass casual scrutiny. That wasn't done for a random tenant. I went back through my memories, not emotionally, but selectively. Work projects, meetings, times I'd been in rooms where decisions were made. One moment kept resurfacing. 6 months earlier, my department had been asked to participate in a cross-functional review related to vendor compliance. It was routine, boring. We'd been given spreadsheets to verify, signatures to confirm, anomalies to flag. I remembered noticing something odd then. A vendor with overlapping services. duplicate billing codes. The same work described 3 different ways. I'd flagged it in a comment, nothing dramatic, just a note asking for clarification. The comment had disappeared in the next revision. At the time, I'd assumed it was cleaned up, or deemed irrelevant. I hadn't followed up. That wasn't my role. But now, thinking about Evergreen's procurement notice, about compliance consulting, about HR's quiet involvement, the memory sharpened. What if I hadn't been targeted because I was unstable? What if I'd been targeted because I was observant? That possibility settled heavily in my chest. I didn't have proof, not yet, but it reframed everything. This wasn't about removing a problem tenant, or even a problem employee. It was about removing friction. I thought about Rachel Bloom's name on the Evergreen filing, HR, risk mitigation. The way my supervisor had looked genuinely confused, like she was watching something unfold that she didn't fully understand. I was collateral. That understanding changed how I felt about confrontation. Confrontation assumed a misunderstanding, assumed a chance at resolution. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a maneuver. So I stopped thinking in terms of justice and started thinking in terms of exit. What would it look like to disengage from the version of my life they were manipulating? Not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly. I made a list, this time not of losses, but of dependencies. My job depended on my badge access. My badge access depended on HR's review. HR's review depended on Evergreen's narrative. Evergreen's narrative depended on my digital footprint continuing to exist. If I kept fighting for my old position inside that structure, I would stay exposed to it. But if I stepped away on my own terms, I could break the chain. The thought felt almost irresponsible. Walking away from a job in this economy, from a lease dispute still unresolved, from a mess I hadn't cleaned up. But something inside me was very clear. They expected me to keep trying to get back in. That expectation was leverage. That night, I drafted an email to HR. I didn't send it right away. I just wrote it. I thanked them for their time. I acknowledged the review. And then I stated, plainly, that I would be taking an unpaid leave of absence effective immediately to address personal matters. I requested confirmation of the terms under which my employment status would be frozen, not terminated, not escalated, frozen. The next morning, I sent it. The reply came within an hour. They approved it. Just like that, the pressure eased not because the problem was solved, but because one of the main levers had been removed. Evergreen could no longer threaten my employment if I wasn't actively employed. I felt something loosen in my chest. With that step taken, I finally called the auditor. Her name was Elaine Foster. She remembered me immediately, which surprised me. "You flagged something once," she said, after I reminded her who I was. "A vendor issue. I remember thinking you were careful." Careful, another word that landed differently now. I didn't explain everything. Not yet. I told her I had concerns about a third-party compliance vendor and wanted to understand how audits were initiated. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking the right questions," she said finally, "but you're also asking them in the wrong order." "Ari, what order should I be asking them in?" "Not as an affected individual," she replied. "As a data point." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't need to accuse anyone," she said. "You need to let the system audit itself, quietly." She explained then how audits actually began. Not with complaints, not with lawsuits, but with anomalies. Inconsistent billing, overlapping services, vendors that existed more on paper than in practice. "Evergreen sounds like a shell," she said. "If it is, it will collapse under its own weight once it's examined, but only if someone asks the right neutral questions." "Who asks them?" She smiled faintly. I hung up, feeling steadier than I had in weeks, but also aware of something else. If I let Elaine pull that thread, Evergreen would eventually unravel. And when it did, whoever had benefited from it would know someone had noticed. Which meant I had to be ready. Not to fight. To leave. Over the next few days, I made quiet preparations. I stopped contesting the lease. I arranged to formally surrender the unit once my belongings were returned or declared lost. I accepted that the apartment was gone. I redirected my mail permanently. I closed accounts I didn't need. I simplified everything down to what I could carry. This wasn't defeat. It was strategy. By choosing not to claw my way back into the old structure, I removed myself from the blast radius of what was coming. And something else happened. Something I hadn't anticipated. I felt lighter. Not relieved, not happy, but unburdened by the constant need to explain myself. For weeks, I'd been trapped in reaction mode, responding to moves I hadn't chosen. Now, for the first time, I was making decisions no one else had planned for. That evening, as I sat on the bed in the new hotel, phone face down beside me, I understood the difference between being powerless and being unentangled. Powerlessness is being stuck inside someone else's story. Unentangled is realizing you don't have to play the role they wrote for you. Whatever happened next, whatever Elaine uncovered, whatever Evergreen tried to contain, I wouldn't be there waiting for permission to exist. I had stopped trying to prove I was stable. I had stopped trying to be believed. And in doing so, I'd crossed an invisible line. I wasn't the subject of the story anymore. I was stepping out of it. Stepping out of the story didn't mean disappearing. It meant choosing where my presence still mattered. Once I took the unpaid leave, the daily emails stopped. No more checking in. No more carefully worded concern. The silence was immediate and telling. Systems don't chase people who are no longer useful inputs. I used that quiet. Every morning, I went to the same coffee shop 2 blocks from the new hotel. Not because I loved the coffee, it was bitter and overpriced, but because it had a rhythm. Same barista, same regulars, same corner table with a view of the street. I needed something predictable while everything else stayed fluid. I brought my folder with me. The printed documents, the timelines, the procurement notice with Evergreen's name on it like a smudge you couldn't scrub out. I didn't open it right away. I watched the street instead, people crossing with purpose. Delivery trucks double parked. Life moving without me. That was the point. I wasn't trying to interrupt anything yet. I was letting the system keep walking while a thread loosened behind it. Elaine didn't call for a week. That wasn't a delay. That was preparation. Auditors don't rush. They create space and then watch what fills it. In the meantime, I focused on the only thing still under my control: how information moved away from me. I stopped replying to Evergreen entirely. No emails. No texts. Nothing. I let their messages stack up unanswered, their tone shifting subtly over time. Polite reminders became firmer notices. Firm notices became procedural warnings. Then, abruptly, they stopped. That change mattered more than anything they'd said before. It told me someone had realized I was no longer engaging the way I was supposed to. 3 days later, I received a new email. Different sender, same ecosystem. It came from a legal assistant at my former leasing company. She requested a final confirmation of my intent to surrender the unit and asked me to sign a release waiving any future claims related to the termination. I read it carefully, twice. They weren't asking for money. They weren't threatening action. They wanted closure. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded it to Elaine. She replied an hour later with a single sentence. "They're nervous." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, Elaine called. "I can't share details," she said immediately. "But I can tell you this. Evergreen is being looked at." My pulse quickened. "How seriously?" "Enough that they're scrambling," she replied. "Enough that some people are trying to distance themselves." I pictured Rachel Bloom's name on that filing. The HR conference room. The man with the legal pad. "Do I need to do anything?" I asked. "No," Elaine said. "You need to do exactly what you've been doing. Stay out of the way." Out of the way didn't mean passive. It meant invisible in the right places. Over the next 2 weeks, small things shifted. Quietly. Almost imperceptibly. The collections account disappeared from my credit report without explanation. The inquiry vanished like it had never been there. I checked twice, convinced I was misreading it. Then my bank lifted the address verification flag without me asking. A week later, I received a refund for the early termination fees. No apology. Just a transaction, labeled adjustment. Each correction felt surgical, clean, as if someone were carefully removing fingerprints from a scene. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I just watched. Evergreen's website went offline for maintenance. The phone number stopped connecting. Emails bounced back with automated replies. Then, one afternoon, Elaine called again. "They're dissolving one of the LLCs," she said, quietly. "Which one?" "Compliance Consulting." I closed my eyes. That was the thread. The one tied to HR. The one that linked my work life to my housing situation. "What happens to the people involved?" I asked. "That depends," she said carefully, "on how much they knew and how much they signed off on." I thought about the authorization form with the almost correct email address. The fake version of me that had existed just long enough to authorize my own removal. "They knew," I said, not angrily, just certain. Elaine didn't disagree. That evening, I received a message from Daniel at Evergreen. "The first in days. We've identified an internal discrepancy related to your file. Please contact us to resolve outstanding matters." I stared at the message, then deleted it. Resolution was no longer my job. 2 days later, my supervisor called. "I wanted you to hear this from me," she said, voice tight. "The review is being closed. HR says there were irregularities with the information we received. I think for used our 5 or 17. Irregularities," I repeated. "Yes, they're reassessing some vendor relationships. And my status?" There was a pause. "You're welcome to return when you're ready." I thanked her and hung up. I didn't say yes. That was the part no one expected. They had prepared for anger, for relief, for gratitude, for demands. They hadn't prepared for indifference. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the moment settle. My old job, was technically available again. My credit was stabilizing. The immediate threats had receded. The system had corrected itself. At least on paper. But paper had been the problem all along. That night, I opened my laptop and drafted a resignation letter. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It didn't reference Evergreen or forged documents or risk assessments. It said, simply, that I had decided to pursue other opportunities and thanked the company for the experience. I scheduled it to send the following morning. When I woke up, I felt steady. Not vindicated. Not triumphant. Resolved. The email sent at 9 a.m. Exactly. By noon, my phone buzzed with a reply from HR asking if I'd reconsider, emphasizing the resolution of prior concerns. I didn't respond. Instead, I went for a long walk. I walked until the city thinned out, until the streets grew quieter and the noise of traffic faded into a low hum. I passed neighborhoods that didn't know me, parks where no one looked twice, storefronts that had nothing to do with my past. For the first time since this began, my future felt unclaimed. Elaine called later that afternoon. "You did the right thing," she said, before I could speak. "I didn't win," I replied. She laughed softly. "You weren't supposed to." That stuck with me. Winning would have meant reinstatement. Apologies. Public acknowledgement. But that would have required staying inside the same machinery that had almost erased me. What I had done instead was refuse to be the cleanup. I'd let the system eat itself. As the days passed, news trickled through quietly. A reorganization in HR. A compliance review expanded. A vendor relationship terminated. Names shuffled. Responsibilities reassigned. No one called it what it was. They never do. And through all of it, my name didn't come up. That was the real victory. Not being restored to my place, but removed from their narrative entirely. I found a short-term rental through a private landlord. Month to month. No HOA, no management company. A small place above a garage with creaky stairs and uneven floors. It wasn't impressive. It was safe. On move-in day, I carried my boxes upstairs myself. There weren't many of them. I set them down in the living room and stood there, breathing in the dust and the quiet. I had lost things I would never get back. Time, trust, a sense of ease. But I had kept something else. Choice. By stepping sideways instead of pushing forward, I had denied them the ending they expected. And as I locked the door behind me that night, my lock, my key, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. I didn't need to be cleared. I needed to be gone. Whatever story they were trying to tell about me could keep running. I wasn't in it anymore. After I moved into the small place above the garage, the world didn't snap back into focus the way I'd imagined it might. There was no sense of arrival, No moment where I could finally exhale and say, "This is over." Instead, life settled into something quieter and more uncertain, like standing in the aftermath of a storm, not yet sure which structures were still standing because the wind hadn't fully died down. I unpacked slowly. Not because there was much to unpack, but because I wanted to feel each decision. Where the plates went, which drawer held the silverware, whether the lamp belonged near the couch or the window. These were small choices, but they were mine, and that mattered more than I'd expected. The days that followed were strangely uneventful. No emails from Evergreen, no calls from HR, no notices from the leasing company. The silence felt deliberate, like a held breath. I didn't trust it yet. Every morning, I checked my credit report. Every afternoon, I logged into my bank account. I monitored my email the way you listen for footsteps outside a door. Nothing happened. And yet, I felt more alert than I ever had during the chaos. Elaine called once that week. She didn't give details, just fragments. "There's been an expansion," she said. "More departments pulled in." "Because of Evergreen?" I asked. "Because of patterns," she replied. Evergreen was just the doorway. End quote. I thanked her and hung up, staring at my phone for a long time afterward. The idea that this was larger than me, that what I'd stumbled into had tentacles I'd never seen, should have terrified me. Instead, it made my decision feel even more necessary. Had I stayed, had I insisted on reinstatement, I would have been caught in the middle of something that was now unfolding at a scale far beyond my control. Meetings. Internal reviews. Quiet interviews. All the machinery that grinds slowly and without regard for individuals. I wasn't part of that machinery anymore. A week after I resigned, I received a final email from HR. It was brief, polite. It confirmed the acceptance of my resignation and included instructions for returning company property. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a sentence that caught my eye. "We regret any confusion or inconvenience caused by prior communications." Confusion. That word did a lot of work for them. It suggested fog where there had been intent. Accident where there had been design. I stared at it for a long moment, then closed the email without replying. I boxed up my badge and laptop and mailed them back with tracking. No note, no explanation. I didn't want a paper trail of emotion. The following Monday, I woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. Sunlight crept through the thin curtains, catching dust motes in the air. I lay there longer than usual, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood. A car starting somewhere down the street, a door opening, someone's radio playing faintly. This was what normal sounded like. Later that morning, I went for a walk, not to clear my head, not to think, just to move. I took a different route than usual, letting my feet decide where to go. I passed houses with peeling paint, a small park with a broken swing, a coffee shop that looked like it hadn't changed since the 90s. At a crosswalk, I paused, waiting for the light. A man next to me checked his phone, frowned, and muttered something under his breath about work. I watched him without really seeing him, struck by how close I'd come to being trapped in that same restless loop forever. When the light changed, we crossed, then went our separate ways. That afternoon, Elaine sent a short text. "They're restructuring HR leadership." I read it twice, then set my phone down. There it was. The outward sign of an inward shift. Titles would change, roles would be reassigned, statements would be crafted. No one would call it accountability, but everyone involved would feel the impact. I wondered briefly if Rachel Bloom was still employed, if she was sitting in an office somewhere, watching her carefully constructed tool dissolve piece by piece, if she knew exactly why. The thought didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought distance. That night, I dreamed about my old townhouse. Not the lockout, not the sticker on the door, just the living room as it used to be. Sunlight on the carpet, the sound of my keys dropping onto the table. In the dream, I stood there for a long time, then turned and walked out without closing the door behind me. When I woke up, my chest felt lighter. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects continued. Quietly, methodically. A vendor relationship terminated. A compliance review extended. A memo circulated reminding managers to verify third-party data independently. I didn't hear any of this directly. It came through side channels, a former coworker's vague comment, Elaine's occasional updates, headlines that didn't name names but hinted at internal controls and process improvements. I stayed away from all of it. Instead, I focused on rebuilding something simpler. I picked up freelance work. Nothing glamorous. Contract projects that paid enough to cover rent and groceries. I kept my schedule loose. My commitments minimal. When people asked what I was doing now, I gave a version of the truth that didn't invite questions. I took some time off, I'd say. Reassessing. They nodded, satisfied. In this culture, burnout is the only acceptable explanation for withdrawal. One evening, while organizing the last of my boxes, I found the folder Elaine had returned to me months earlier. Copies of everything I'd uncovered, IP logs, authorization forms, filings. I considered throwing it away. It felt like a relic from a life I didn't inhabit anymore, but I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. Instead, I placed it in the back of a drawer, not hidden, just no longer central. Evidence doesn't always need to be used. Sometimes, it just needs to exist. A month after my resignation, I received an unexpected message. Not from Evergreen. Not from HR. From my former supervisor. "I wanted to check in," she wrote. "I hope you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I am," I typed. "I hope you are too." She responded with a thumbs-up emoji. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to bridge the gap. And somehow, that was enough. Because I understood now that she'd been as constrained as I had been, just in a different way. Bound by loyalty, by role, by the unspoken rules that keep systems running even when they're wrong. I didn't blame her. Blame would have tied me back to something I was trying to release. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter. Leaves piled up along the sidewalks, the air sharpened. I bought a second-hand coat from a thrift store and wore it everywhere, grateful for its weight. One afternoon, as I was closing the garage door behind me, my phone buzzed. It was Elaine. "They're finalizing the audit," she said. "Evergreen is done." Done how? Dissolved. Assets frozen. The remaining entities are under review. I leaned against the door, letting the words sink in. "And the people?" I asked quietly. She exhaled. "Consequences will be uneven. Some will walk away, some won't." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you," I said, "not just for the audit. For everything." "You did this," she replied. "You just didn't stay to watch." After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, staring at the concrete floor. The story was ending. Not with a headline, not with a confrontation, but with a slow unwinding, the way things do when they've been held together by pretense for too long. I felt no urge to reinsert myself. No desire to tell anyone what had happened. The system had corrected itself, as much as systems ever do, and I had already made my exit. That night, I cooked dinner in my small kitchen and ate at the counter, listening to the radio play softly in the background. The announcer talked about traffic, about weather, about things that mattered to other people. I washed my plate, dried it, and set it back in the cabinet. The ordinary act felt like a quiet declaration. I was still here, but I was no longer waiting for permission to be. The moment of reversal didn't arrive with celebration. It didn't come with raised voices, apologies, or dramatic admissions of guilt. It came the way most real endings do, quietly, through a series of small confirmations that added up to something final. I was sitting at the narrow desk by the window, working through a contract proposal for a freelance client, when my phone buzzed, a notification from my credit monitoring service. I almost ignored it. By then, I'd trained myself not to react to every alert like it was an emergency. But something made me open it. No active collections accounts. I refreshed the page. Once. Twice. The early termination fees were gone, not disputed, not under review, removed, as if they had never existed. A few minutes later, an email came in from the leasing company. Not the same representatives I'd spoken to before. Someone higher up, judging by the signature block. It was brief. They acknowledged procedural inconsistencies in the handling of my lease termination. They stated that the account was being closed with no further action required. They wished me well. No apology, no explanation, just closure. I sat back in my chair, hands resting on my knees, and waited for the rush of vindication that never came. Instead, what I felt was something closer to confirmation, the quiet kind that settles into your bones. The system had reversed itself, not because I demanded it, not because I argued harder or proved I was right, because something behind the scenes had become inconvenient. That afternoon, Elaine texted, "It's done." I didn't need to ask what she meant. HR finalized the changes, she added. The vendor relationships tied to Evergreen are officially terminated. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Thank you. Her response came almost immediately. You don't owe anyone gratitude, she wrote. You survived a bad structure. I turned my phone face down and went for a walk. The air had shifted, late fall now, the light softer, the colors muted. I walked through the neighborhood without any particular destination, noticing things I hadn't before. The way one house always had its porch light on, even during the day. The stray cat that slept under the same bush every afternoon. The faint smell of bread from a nearby bakery. I realized something as I walked. This was the first day since everything began that I wasn't waiting for another shoe to drop. There were no more alerts to anticipate. No more emails to dread. No more narratives being written about me in rooms I wasn't in. The pressure that had lived in my chest for weeks had eased, leaving behind a strange emptiness. Not relief exactly. More like space. That evening, my former supervisor called. I wanted to tell you personally, she said, sounding tired. The situation with the vendor was not what we were told. I'm sorry you were caught in it. I understand, I replied. And I did. She hesitated. If you ever wanted to come back. I cut her off gently. I won't. There was silence on the line. Okay, she said finally. I hope you're doing well. I am, I said. And this time, it wasn't something I had to convince myself of. After we hung up, I sat on the couch and let the room settle around me. The small apartment creaked as the temperature dropped outside. The heater kicked on with a soft click. Everything felt ordinary. That ordinariness was the victory. Later that night, I opened my email and saw one final message from Evergreen's domain. It had been delayed, stuck in transit, likely sent before their systems shut down. It read, "Please confirm receipt of prior communications to ensure resolution." I didn't respond. I deleted it without reading it again. There was nothing left to resolve. Over the next few days, the last loose ends tied themselves off. My credit score rebounded. The P.O. box was closed. The folder of documents stayed in the drawer, untouched. Friends noticed the change before I did. You seem lighter, one of them said over coffee. Like you stopped bracing for something. I smiled, not trusting myself to explain. What I didn't tell anyone was how close I'd come to fighting this differently. How easy it would have been to stay. To push for reinstatement. To demand acknowledgement. To insist on an apology. That path would have looked like victory from the outside. But it would have required staying inside a system that had already shown me how easily it could erase me. Instead, I had chosen something else. I had chosen to leave the game entirely. One afternoon, while organizing my files, I came across the resignation letter I'd sent weeks earlier. I read it again, noticing how neutral it sounded, how careful, how unlike the turmoil I'd been living in at the time. At the bottom of the email thread was HR's final response, confirming my departure. We wish you success in your future endeavors. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, that sentence didn't feel like a dismissal. It felt like a release. The reversal had happened. Quietly. Completely. But it hadn't returned anything to me. It had simply removed the threat. And that distinction mattered. Because what I'd gained wasn't my old life back. It was the knowledge that I didn't need it. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the floor, I cooked dinner and ate slowly, savoring the simple act of not being rushed. I washed the dishes and set them on the rack to dry. I locked the door and checked it once, out of habit. Then I stopped. I didn't need to check again. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, a thought crossed my mind, one that would have terrified me months earlier. If this happened again, I would know what to do. Not because I had more power, but because I no longer mistook permission for safety. The system had closed the loop, and I had already stepped beyond it. People expect the ending of a story like this to arrive with balance restored. Apologies issued, names cleared, a return to what was taken. That's how we're taught to recognize justice. Something broken gets fixed, and everyone agrees it's fixed. That didn't happen. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, harder to explain. A week after the lease issue was formally closed and the last of the administrative threads disappeared, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to it later while standing at the kitchen counter, absently wiping down a surface that didn't really need cleaning. "Olivia, this is Rachel Bloom," the voice said. Calm, measured, professional to the end. "I was hoping we could speak. I'd like to clear the air." Clear the air. I stood there for a long moment, phone in hand, listening to the silence that followed her message. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking. I felt nothing. And that absence of reaction startled me more than rage ever could have. I didn't call her back. The next day, she emailed. Shorter this time. Less formal. "I know things escalated beyond what anyone intended. I think a conversation could be helpful for both of us." Helpful. I read the message once, then archived it. There was a time when I would have said yes immediately. Sat down, listened, tried to understand her reasoning, tried to make sense of how someone could justify turning my life into a line item under risk mitigation. I would have wanted acknowledgement, an admission that what she'd done was wrong, that I hadn't imagined it, but something fundamental had shifted. I no longer needed her to confirm my reality. That need, the desire to be recognized as harmed, was the last thread tying me to the version of myself who had been vulnerable to this in the first place. If I met with her now, the power dynamic would quietly reset. She would explain. I would listen. She would frame it as a mistake, a miscalculation, an overreach. And in doing so, she would reclaim something she had already lost, relevance in my life. I wasn't willing to give that back. Over the following days, similar gestures appeared. A former colleague asked if I'd be open to coffee. Someone from HR sent a vague message, wishing me well and expressing regret for how things unfolded. None of it felt malicious. None of it felt sincere either. It felt like cleanup. People trying to smooth the edges of something sharp so they wouldn't cut themselves on it later. I declined all of it. Not rudely. Not dramatically. I simply didn't engage. That decision confused people. I could tell. In this culture, forgiveness is expected once the threat has passed. Reconciliation is framed as maturity. Walking away is often read as bitterness. But bitterness requires attachment. I had already let go. One afternoon, while sorting through the last box I hadn't unpacked, I came across the fireproof pouch that now held my newly replaced documents. Passport, birth certificate, social security card, proof of identity reconstructed piece by piece. I ran my fingers over the zipper and felt a strange wave of grief, not for what I'd lost, but for how much effort it had taken to prove I existed. That was the thing no one apologized for. Not the stress, not the inconvenience. The presumption that my reality was negotiable. I zipped the pouch closed and placed it in the back of a drawer, out of sight. That evening, I went for a walk as the sun dipped below the rooftops. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from routine rather than emptiness. Lights flicked on in living rooms. Someone laughed somewhere down the block. A dog barked once, then settled. I realized then that this was the first time in my adult life that no one had leverage over me. Not an employer. Not a landlord. Not a third-party service quietly reshaping my story. That kind of freedom doesn't feel exhilarating at first. It feels exposed. Because with no one to answer to, there's no one to hide behind either. A few days later, Elaine called. "They asked me about you," she said, not bothering with context. "Who did?" "Legal. Internal review. They wanted to know if you'd be willing to provide a statement." I leaned against the kitchen counter, considering it. A statement would solidify the record. Lock the narrative. Assign responsibility. It would also tether me to something I was already done carrying. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "That you were unavailable," she said. and that it wouldn't change the findings. I exhaled slowly. Thank you. She hesitated. You know, some people might see this as you walking away from accountability. I know, I said. And you're okay with that? I thought about Rachel's voicemail, the emails, the polite attempts to reassert connection. Yes, I replied, because accountability that depends on my participation was never real to begin with. Elaine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, softly, that might be the healthiest thing I've heard all week. After we hung up, I sat down at the small table by the window and watched the light fade. I thought about how many times I'd imagined this ending differently. Standing my ground, being proven right, watching consequences unfold in a way that felt proportional. But proportionality is a myth we cling to when we still want something from the people who hurt us. What I wanted now was distance. I didn't want apologies shaped to minimize liability. I didn't want explanations polished to protect reputations. I didn't want to be the example people used to feel better about a system that had almost crushed me. I wanted my life to belong to me again. And that meant refusing the final act everyone else expected. No reconciliation. No forgiveness ceremony. No neat moral bow. Just a clean exit. A few weeks later, I deleted my old work email account entirely. Closed the last folder tied to my previous address. Changed my phone number, not out of fear, but out of finality. These were not acts of erasure. They were acts of authorship. I was deciding which parts of my past were allowed to follow me forward. On the last day of November, I sat on the floor of my living room with a cup of coffee, the heater humming softly in the background. Outside, the first real cold of the season settled in. The world felt slower, quieter. I thought about the person I'd been at the beginning of all this, standing at a gas station counter, listening to a voicemail she didn't understand yet. She had believed that the right response to harm was to fix it. What she hadn't known was that sometimes the most powerful response is refusal. Refusal to explain. Refusal to engage. Refusal to step back into a structure that has already shown you who it protects. I didn't need the system to admit it was wrong. I needed it to stop having access to me. And it did. Not because it chose to. Because I chose to leave. By the time winter fully settled in, the story had already ended. It just took my body longer than my mind to catch up. December arrived quietly. No announcements. No emails. No lingering threads to pull. The small apartment above the garage grew colder at night, and I learned which floorboard creaked the loudest, which corner of the kitchen caught the morning light. These details anchored me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't rebuilding my old life. I was living a different one. My days became simple. Wake up, make coffee, open my laptop, work for a few hours, take a break when my eyes got tired instead of when a calendar told me to. In the afternoons, I walked. Sometimes with purpose, sometimes without. I stopped apologizing for being unavailable. At first, that felt wrong. We're trained to explain absences, to justify choices, to reassure people that our deviation from the expected path is temporary. I found myself drafting explanations in my head, then deleting them before they ever left my mouth. I just needed a change. I'm figuring things out. It made sense at the time. Eventually, I stopped offering reasons at all. And something unexpected happened. No one demanded them. Friends adjusted. Conversations shifted. Invitations became more flexible, less transactional. Without the weight of my former role attached to me, people interacted with me differently, less assumption, more curiosity. I realized how much of my identity had been shaped by access. Access to a building. Access to systems. Access to credibility borrowed from institutions. When that access was taken away, I had panicked. I thought I was disappearing. What I hadn't understood was that access had also been a leash. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork for tax season, I came across a printout of my old lease, the version before everything went wrong. I almost threw it away without looking. Then I paused. I read it slowly, line by line, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The language, the assumptions, the clauses that gave power without accountability. None of it was unusual. That was the unsettling part. This wasn't a malicious document. It was a normal one. I folded it once and placed it back in the drawer, not as evidence, As a reminder, normal structures can still harm you. They don't have to break rules to do it. As the holidays approached, messages trickled in, well wishes, generic greetings, a few invitations I declined without guilt. I spent Christmas alone, by choice, cooked a simple meal, watched a movie I'd already seen, fell asleep on the couch before midnight. It was peaceful. On New Year's Eve, I stood outside just before midnight, bundled in my thrift store coat, watching fireworks bloom faintly over the rooftops. Someone nearby counted down. Cheers erupted, doors slammed, laughter echoed. I didn't make a resolution. I didn't need one. Everything I'd once planned for myself had already been undone, and in the wreckage, I discovered something steadier than ambition. Autonomy, the freedom to decide where my life connected and where it ended. In January, I signed a longer lease for the apartment above the garage. 6 months, month to month after that. The landlord was an older man who fixed things himself and preferred checks to online portals. He didn't ask many questions. He didn't need my story. I liked that. The first time something broke the bathroom sink, a slow leak, I texted him. He came by the next day, fixed it in 15 minutes, and left without commentary. No tickets, no case numbers, no third-party services. Just a problem solved. Standing there watching him work, I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me. This was what safety actually looked like. Not perfection, not guarantees, but proportion. When something went wrong, it stayed the size it was supposed to be. I kept freelancing. The work grew slowly. A recommendation here, a repeat client there. Nothing spectacular, nothing that made for impressive explanations at dinner parties. But it was enough. More than enough. One afternoon, months later, I received a notification I hadn't expected. A background check service updated my profile. I stared at the screen for a moment, then closed it. I didn't feel relief. I felt indifference, because somewhere along the way, being clear had stopped being the goal. What mattered was that no one could quietly rewrite me anymore. The folder of documents stayed in the back of the drawer. I never opened it again. Not because it didn't matter, but because I didn't need to carry proof of what I'd survived in order to move forward. That spring, I planted herbs in small pots by the window. Basil, rosemary, mint. I watered them every morning, watching for growth, watching for signs that something was taking root. They thrived. I thought about how close I'd come to spending years trying to correct the record, to reclaim a reputation, to prove a version of myself that had already been used against me. Walking away hadn't erased what happened. It had ended its influence. There's a difference. Sometimes people ask me now if I regret not pushing for more, for public accountability, for acknowledgement, for something that looks like justice from the outside. I tell them the truth. I don't regret it, because the cost of staying engaged would have been my future, and I had already paid enough. What I learned isn't something I share lightly, but it lives quietly in the way I make decisions now. I read the fine print. I limit dependencies. I leave when something feels wrong, even if I can't yet explain why. Not out of fear, out of respect for myself. The system didn't give me my life back. It stopped interfering with it. And that was enough, because in the end, the most powerful form of justice wasn't being proven right. It was choosing not to belong to something that had already decided I was expendable. I didn't win. I didn't reconcile. I didn't rebuild what was lost. I did something quieter and far more lasting. I walked away. And in doing so, I kept the one thing no document, no process, no third-party service could ever take from me again: the right to decide where my story ends and where it begins next.